Welcome to the God's Peculiar People podcast, where we learn about the lives and characteristics of God's people. Today we're heading back in time to explore the second era of modern missions, the era that saw more missionaries leaving the coast and heading into the interior to reach more people with the gospel. Now, I want to clarify something when talking about the missionaries throughout these different eras. I am generalizing and assuming when I say that they were going to reach people with the gospel. That is the Great Commission and the reason we should go to another nation or people group. But as I say that, I am aware that there were and are today people who serve as missionaries who go for less than evangelistic reasons, and there may be negative reports about some of those people. But the purpose of this podcast is to share at least a glimpse of the life of preachers, missionaries, hymn writers, etc., to spark your interest so you and I both can go and learn more about these people. They are human. Many of them made an impact, but they, like us, and the examples God gives us in the Bible, are not perfect. We can take the good from their lives and learn from that, while also noting the bad so that we can avoid it. In the future, we may talk about David Livingstone, William Carey, men who helped to open up fields for missionaries, but whose families suffered greatly as a result. But that is a topic for the future. For now, on to the second era of modern missions. Most people attribute the move to the interior to Hudson Taylor, and from the fact that he was the first to establish a mission whose entire goal was to go inland, it makes sense to give him credit. Yet a little over 10 years before the establishment of the China Inland Mission, David Livingstone was already pushing inland. Having sent his family back to Britain, Livingstone was free to embark on a serious exploration of the continent of Africa. Now, we could argue about the legitimacy of Livingstone's exploration because was he focused on opening the continent to the outside world for commercial or evangelistic purposes? Again, another topic for another time, but it did help to open up the field for missionaries to see, hey, there's more people inland, we can go farther, let's move forward. So it did in that way help. Now, doing just a cursory look on the web, I found that in 1850, a Southern Baptist missionary, Thomas Johnson Brown, he also began pushing inland in Africa to what is modern-day Nigeria. And in 1834, the American Presbyterian Mission opened a work in Punjab. This region borders modern-day India and Pakistan. So, while most missionary work was still focused on the coast, there were a few missionaries who saw the need to go inland, and that movement began to take off in the late 1800s. Now, let's look specifically at Hudson Taylor and the inland movement that was sparked. On September 19th, 1853, under the auspices of the Chinese Evangelization Society, who had paid for Taylor to be trained as a doctor, though his education was cut short, Hudson Taylor set sail for his first stint of service in China. Taylor would not reach Shanghai, China until March 1st, 1854. He arrived during the Civil War, and it was not until the following year that he started out on a preaching tour of a week or more. Taylor would complete 10 such journeys during his first 2 years in China. Taylor traveled to Sunming, where he felt would be a good place to labor, but he had to return to Shanghai to restock on medical supplies, and then he was ordered to leave Sunming permanently. The local doctors had complained about losing business to the foreign doctor, and local leaders kicked him out. The 6 weeks he spent there are considered his first inland experience. There was not smooth sailing in the work in those first 7 years. From dealing with the Civil War to illness, the heat, and people throwing mud and stones, Hudson Taylor continued to labor on. It was also during this time that he met and married Maria Dyer, after being rejected by the woman he proposed to back home. Taylor's health deteriorated so much at this time that it was believed that only a furlough could prolong his life, so back to England they went. During the 5.5 years that Taylor remained in England, he was not idle. He began translating a New Testament and wrote the book China, Its Spiritual Needs and Claims. But how was the China Inland Mission born? It's said to have taken place in June 1865. Taylor was walking on the beach of Brighton. He was burdened by the thought of the 400 million Chinese who were facing a Christless eternity. He believed that God wanted him to form a new mission agency, China Inland Mission. A few things would be different about his mission than other missions of that day, namely, members of the mission would rely solely on God for funds. Members would focus their efforts on the unreached population of inland China. Members would adopt local dress, eat Chinese food, and attempt to live like the people with whom they would reside. The mission would be non-denominational, the mission would be governed from China, and the mission would be run not by a board, but by a general director. Just a year later, in 1866, Hudson Taylor and his family, which now included 4 children, and 16 workers, boarded a ship and set sail for China. By the end of the year, 24 missionaries would be serving in 4 stations across inland China. So we see Hudson Taylor kind of coming up with the idea. There is another man involved in it, one who, when he stayed behind in England, I forgot his name now, but he stayed behind in England to help kind of boost support, to get money to discuss the mission among people in England so that money could be sent to Hudson Taylor, kind of making sure everyone was aware of what was happening and reminding them. But I've forgotten his name, unfortunately. But we see the mission beginning to thrive. From 1866, it started with just 24 missionaries and 4 stations, but by 1915, there were 1,063 missionaries working at 227 stations. Among those numbers were the Cambridge 7, who we'll talk about in the future. Just a few short years later, in 1934, there were 1,368 workers at 364 stations throughout China. After 1934, with the Sino-Japanese War, followed by World War II, and then the communist takeover of the country, the missionaries were ordered to leave. The last China Inland missionaries would leave China in 1953. Now, word got around about the work that Hudson Taylor and his China Inland Mission was doing, and I read somewhere, that I cannot find the quote now, that some 40 missionary societies focused on reaching the inland areas of the nations were formed after the China Inland Mission. Some of those missions were the Sudan Interior Mission, the Africa Inland Mission, Heart of Africa Mission, Regions Beyond Missionary Union, etc. A reminder of another missionary who also was pushing inland, specifically in the country of Africa, was Mary Slessor. And if you have not listened to the audiobook we read last year about Mary Slessor, there will be a link in the description to those episodes. But reading about Mary Slessor or listening to the book, throughout Mary's ministry, she kept pushing inland. She would reach one group, and then she would go farther, or groups would come to her, asking her to come and work among them. So we see some of the push inland was from the people themselves. They were asking for missionaries to come to them. And so this was an exciting time of missions. People were moving out from the coast, and when people saw, hey, there's missionaries, more could have been because of they're American, they're European, we want them, whatever they have, we want them to come to us. But that opened the door for these missionaries to be able to go inland and to reach more people. And it's very exciting, especially the book about Mary Slessor, to read that. It's very exciting to see how that worked and how it can still work today. Now, the second era of modern missions followed the end of the war between the states and ran through the Second World War. And during this time, we find some movements that aided the growth of mission societies and the push for missionaries to go to the field. First, we see the founding of a mission faith organization, the idea that going out by faith, that God would supply the needs for mission work. We see the Bible Institute movement. During this era, we find the founding and growth of Bible Institutes formed by men like A.B. Simpson, the founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and D.L. Moody, who founded the Moody Bible Institute. And these are just 2 of the many Bible Institutes that came to life and flourished at this time. Also, there's the student volunteer movement. Leaders in the U.S. were challenging young people to give their lives to reach the world with the gospel. And from about 1890 to 1935, more than 20,000 young people would go to a mission. While reading up on the second era of modern missions, I realized that there is much I do not know about this time frame of missions. I have read about David Livingstone, Amy Carmichael, C.T. Studd, Gladys Aylward, Jonathan Goforth, E. Stanley Jones, Mary Slessor, etc., but yet I was not aware of the major shift from the coastal to inland work in this area. So that is something that I will be reading more about in coming days. Now I am shifting my attention to the third era of missions, the era that I am most familiar with because it is an era that I have learned the most about and had the opportunity to participate in. Coming up in the fall, possibly the first episode or 2 in September, I would like to talk a little bit about the missions trips I have had the privilege to go on, and one in particular that I'd like to share a little bit about. So, to share a little bit about my experience with this third era of missions, the attempt to work with specific people groups. Though you see throughout missions trips, thinking back, I can see the broad spectrum. We still go to the coast. We still try to push farther inland, and we are trying to reach people groups specifically. You can see all of those tactics still being used in this third era of modern missions. But that is an episode in the future. Today, that's all I have to say for this episode of the God's Peculiar People podcast. Please make sure you're following along on YouTube to see the daily short videos about a missionary from this second era, and I will talk to you next week.